Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to start talking about armyworms and some of the problems that they cause for producers, how to look for them, and what to do about them. Armyworms can be one of the biggest pests that we have in hay production every summer. These worms don't overwinter in Arkansas, and most of the time the worms that we're talking about here in Hot Spring County are what we actually refer to as fall armyworms, and not the true armyworms that come through North Arkansas around May and target things like our cool season grasses and very early Bermuda. Here in Hot Spring County, our biggest problem is the fall armyworm that's going to target our Bermuda grass, especially fertilized grass that's been well taken care of. We'll normally see it on it. Since that fall armyworm doesn't overwinter in Arkansas, it makes its way up through the south, and we'll start to see it around this time of year through July. It's important to realize that these armyworms can come back every 30 days if you have multiple generations that are repopulating. When you're looking at armyworms, it's important to see what sizes you have and whether you're treating one generation of worms or multiple generations of worms.
There are two main different types of armyworms. There's the true armyworm that's actually seen in the spring farther north in Arkansas. And then there's the fall armyworm that we actually start to see here in the summer in this part of the state. That's the most common when people are talking about armyworms. And there's lots of differences between these two. So when we look at what's the difference in a true armyworm versus a fall armyworm, the true armyworms are more of a pest in April or May, and these can actually survive the winter in Arkansas. And this is why they're seen more in the northern part of the state. They're normally a bigger pest of things like fescue, wheat, ryegrass, and maybe even a little bit of early Bermuda grass. They're mostly a nocturnal feeder, so you won't see them out during the day. And if you're trying to identify them, they don't have that inverted Y on their head, which is what we consider to be the standard for identifying a fall armyworm. The fall armyworms are what most people are starting to see now. This is one of the reasons we're concerned about it in this part of the county, is other counties around us have already started to see them. We start to see them in late June to mid-July, to even in the fall, hence the name the fall armyworm. And they don't overwinter in Arkansas. This is why we can kind of keep track of when they're coming based on when we're starting to see them come out of the south. Southwest Arkansas is normally the first ones to spot these across the state, and that way they kind of give us a heads up that they're headed our direction. And these moths can travel quite a bit of miles, and that's why they spread throughout the state. Normally, these are a pest of Bermuda grass, especially if it's fertilized and been well taken care of. They seem to really like it. They'll also attack things like pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, fescue, signal grass. Winter annuals can be a target, especially right after they're planted and they're starting to come up. Another thing that makes armyworms tough is they can eat anytime. You can go out in the heat of the day and you can normally find armyworms foraging. When we go to identify these, as you can see in the picture on the bottom, they have that inverted Y on their forehead, and that's an indication that that's what we've got. So how much are they really going to consume, and when do they do it? Most of the damage that armyworms cause happens in the last two instars of their life. So the first through the fourth molting, they're not going to cause as big a damage as when they get big. And the thing about it is, if you're scouting and keeping an eye out for armyworms, if you can catch them when they're smaller in that first through third phases, even the fourth, they're so much easier to control and kill than by the time they get to the sixth instar and they're causing the most damage, then they become a lot harder to kill. If you've waited too long and those worms are the larger instars, sometimes there's not as good of chemical control options, but mowing can definitely be an option. If you find them on that hayfield that you're within a week of cutting anyway, and you look at some of the chemical options and they have restrictions on how long you have to wait, lots of times you can go ahead and cut, and that'll get you save your hay crop. You have time to get a hold of it and get control of that population, and you don't lose everything. The problem is if you don't see them when they're smaller, by the time they get to be big, you come in to a hayfield you haven't looked at in 2 weeks, and you come in and it's been wiped out. So keep an eye out, especially this time of year. Have an idea of when you're going to be able to cut so you can help make those decisions on whether to spray or go ahead and cut to salvage your crop.
One of the questions we always get asked is, well, when are they going to be here? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know anybody else that does, but one of the things we can do is watch those counties that are south of us, and some of those counties have already started reporting seeing some. So this is the time to be sure to be scouting your fields, especially those that are close to being cut, keeping an eye out if you fertilize fields, be scouting those fields, and be prepared so that you can get ahead of your armyworms early. One of the most important steps in armyworm control is scouting your fields and getting ahead of your armyworms before you have a major problem. It's really important to scout your field so that you can get ahead of those worms before they get too big and before they destroy your entire crop. Some of the clues to look for as you get ready to scout your field is, are there birds feeding in the field? The producer we're at today, when I talked to him yesterday about coming out to film, he said he very well may have them because he saw a group of crows that were feeding on his field, which is unusual. Birds feeding is a big clue. Another clue is, as you look across the field, it'll look frosted. Sometimes you'll even see dead spots, and that's an indicator sometimes that you may even be too late as you get ready to treat. And the other one is, you drive out there, it smells like it's been freshly cut. We all know what that great smell smells like when a hayfield's just been cut. Well, those worms going in and cutting all your Bermuda grass will do the same thing as well. So once you've scouted, now you start to realize you have a problem. So far today in this field I haven't found any, so we aren't going to be able to look at any worms exactly. But one of the first things you'll need is something to measure a square foot. This is pretty close to a square foot. It's something that I had handy, and that's the thing, is find something that works for you. It's something that you have. And when you're going to put this out, you're going to drop it on a place in your field. And we'll count how many worms are in that spot. As you're doing those counts, you're going to take that measurement in several different places across your field. It's important that we don't just check one area, because we want to make sure that we get control of our worms throughout the field. So you'll take random samples all the way across your field and get an average of what your problem really is in your pasture or your hayfield. As we're counting worms, it's important that we look at how many there are and how big they are. We consider small worms to be less than 1/2 inch, and our large, almost fully grown worms are over 1.5 inches long. And depending on how many worms you have and how large they are is going to be the indication of whether or not you're ready to treat. This field I wouldn't say is ready to treat yet because I haven't been able to find any worms. But with him mentioning he had birds yesterday, I would keep an eye on this field and check it every day for the next week or so, especially knowing that they're coming. If most of your worms are within that 1/2 inch long and they're smaller worms, you can probably justify treating it. If all of your worms are larger, over that 1.5 inch mark, it's really too late to treat. It's going to be hard to find an effective option, and you're probably going to be better off just going ahead and mowing that field.
So if you've scouted, you realize you've got the problem, you're at the threshold, you're not quite ready to cut your hay yet, there are some chemical control options out there, and there's several. The biggest thing, like with any recommendation we give when it comes to chemical control, is make sure you read the label. Some things will require you to have your pesticide applicator license. This is for our commercial operations that need a little extra control. This is not for your typical homeowner. And as you can see in this chart, it labels you which ones are your options that you have to have that restricted license for. If you don't have your license, you do have a few other options as well. And I also like this chart because it tells you some of those grazing restrictions, haying restrictions, what you have to worry about, how much to put out, and how many gallons per acre you're going to need to put out as well. When you start to compare chemicals, another consideration is what kind of residual effect do you have? And so some people are going to want to use a chemical that has a residual, especially if that field is 2 to 3 weeks away from harvesting and you've got several different sizes of worms. If you've got several different sizes, like you see in this picture, that's an indication you've got several generations. So sometimes our longer, more residual products like Besiege, Prevathon, or Intrepid can mean less applications because it's going to hold that residual over a little bit better. The one thing though to keep in mind is that once you cut it or turn cows in to graze it, that's going to eliminate that insecticide you put out. So keep that in mind. And make sure you always remember that harvesting is always a control method as well if your hay or your pasture's at the right timing for that. If you've got more questions about managing armyworms in your pasture and hay fields, don't be afraid to give us a call. There's the MP 144 that's a really great handout, and we've got a fact sheet on it as well. Or if you're getting ready to spray and you just need help calibrating your sprayer, don't ever be afraid to call.
Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week we'll talk about another pest in forage, the Bermuda stem maggot. We'll see you next Friday.